Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today and welcome to our latest webinar on designing a digital real-world study. So today we're going to have a focus on real-world evidence approaches and give examples from actual digital studies. So I'm Anna Richards, Head of Commercial at ViteAccess. I'll be moderating today and I'm joined by Mark Larkin, CEO, and Catherine Bottomley, Chief Scientific Officer at ViteAccess. Just as a little background for these two, Mark has got more than 20 years of experience in HUR and real-world evidence. And when founding ViteAccess, he sought to blend scientific expertise and technology so we could better represent the patient voice in drug development and market access. And the lovely Catherine, she heads up the patient-centered research team and leads the design of patient-reported data acquisition strategies at ViteAccess. So her specialty is in digital real-world primary data collection from patients, caregivers, and clinicians. So over the next 45 minutes, we've got a rich agenda for you today. We'll be following the key parts of designing a real-world study. So I'll take you through what we do and then move over to Catherine for protocol-informed consent and ethics strategy with Mark, and then back to Catherine for data capture strategy, and then collaborative design and information governance. So this will be summarized then with a Q&A session. So you can put forward your questions to us using the Q&A box on the side panel and add them at any point during the webinar, and we'll come to them at the end. So let's get started. Who are we? So we're an established patient-centric research organization specializing in real-world primary data collection from patients, caregivers, and clinicians digitally. So we've got these 5 complementary core capabilities so we can have a collaborative approach in conducting global digital real-world research. So I'll move over to the next slide and we can help you here with end-to-end real-world study management. And you've got here the data capture across mobile, tablet or PC. And we do this through the use of the ViteAccess Real platform. So you've got data capture tool and the real-time research portal to see the data as it's collected. And here you have the flow from the type of participant data capture. So whether it's patients, caregivers or clinician data that needs to be captured, you've got these modules here that enable collection of the granular data. And then this modular architecture allows for very quick study startup and allows you to see the outputs in real time in the research portal. So as you can see, we've got a very, very big agenda today and really rich content. So I'm going to pass over to the experts to tell you more.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Anna. So as Anna has already mentioned, our webinar today focuses on the pre-launch activities when you are designing your digital real-world study. And then we will follow up with a second webinar at a later date with some more information around implementation, practical conduct of these studies. And onto our next slide, this just gives you an overview of the 5 topics that we are going to be covering today. So I'm going to start by talking about protocol design and informed consent. As you'll all know, there's a lot to cover here. So I'm just going to focus on some of the areas and key things that we have found helpful in our experience. So as with any healthcare research study, a study protocol forms a key document in a digital real-world study, both for telling us how the study is going to be conducted, the details of that, but also as a basis for submission to an ethics committee. And I'm sure many people on the webinar today have experienced the frustrations of trying to write a real-world study protocol when the template that you have available is very much designed around clinical trials. Trying to find where the information that you need to include fits around standardized text, standardized headings. And actually, when you add the digital element to that as well, the complexity increases. If you do have the flexibility to be able to use your own template or to develop your own from scratch, we have found this resource particularly helpful. It was published late last year from the ISPOR Harmonized Real World Study Protocol Guidance, and that gives a very useful table of contents with headers that are much more relevant to real world studies as opposed to interventional studies. And it can be used as a great basis for developing a protocol template. As with any protocol, multi-stakeholder input and review is really key. And we're going to come on a little bit later in the webinar today and talking about what we mean by multi-stakeholder input. So moving on now to think about informed consent. So informed consent within a digital study offers many advantages and disadvantages over regular paper-based studies. So in terms of first of all, the challenges that can occur. So when you're thinking about the different devices that a participant may be inputting data on, whether that's a clinician, patient, carer, being able to provide them with all of the information that you need to about the study in a way that is accessible and readable can be quite a challenge, particularly on small device types. And that's where it's really important to think about the user interface. It also offers a bit more flexibility though. We have various ways that we've overcome some of these challenges. And one of those is listing headings for patient information sheets, sections of that patient information sheet, and then allowing participants to click on those headings as they work their way through, scrolling down the screen, and then displaying the relevant information below each of those headings, and actually breaking that up into more digestible small pieces of information. Another thing that we found really useful in our studies is the inclusion of opt-in clauses. We're not always able to do this, but when we do have the flexibility to do so, it can offer real advantages to our sponsors. What we mean by opt-in clauses is, as part of the consent process, asking patient participants whether they consent to being contacted for additional relevant research or for their data to be linked to other perhaps existing data sets or other data sets outside of the study. And the next slide shows you some details around the success of this. So here you can see these are actual studies that we either are working on or have completed in the past. You can see here there's a broad overview of the indication, the geographies within the study, the participant populations, and these are all digital studies using our data capture platform. These are all studies where we ask participants during the consent process whether they would be happy to be contacted for further research. And you can see here the percentage of people who consented to this, ranging from 30% all the way up to 100% for one of our studies. And that has been very useful for the sponsors for these studies. For example, they have conducted additional pieces of research, additional pieces of qualitative research, which has helped them to understand some of the reasons behind the quantitative data provided in studies, and also smaller pieces of more specific quantitative survey-based research. Just moving on now to think about the actual consent process. So there are broadly two ways that this process can work when you're thinking about setting up a digital study. It can either be completed as part of the data collection platform. So whether that is an app-based study, whether that is a website platform, that platform should have capability to be able to obtain participant consent immediately prior to taking part in that activity. However, there are some instances where gathering consent can be delegated as a function of the recruitment method, depending on the setting. And the types of recruitment methods that we're typically used to working with include working with patient advocacy groups, working with clinical sites, specialist recruitment agencies, or broader, more direct approaches through things like specific advertising or snowballing types of recruitment. So it's worth thinking early about where that consent process is going to sit and who will ultimately be responsible for it. So moving on now, Mark's going to take you through ethics strategy.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. So a quick introduction really to ethics and its use in real-world research. So differences from clinical research that people might perhaps be more familiar with. So why to do it then? Well, you know, scientific rigor, if you're hoping to publish the data in peer-reviewed journals, having ethical approval is important. as well as, of course, protecting the interests of patients. If you carry on then. So Ethics Review Board will look at the protocol, informed consent, and patient-facing recruitment materials. So as I said, it's going to ensure that the best interests of patients are kept in mind and it's ethically sound. And they may request some modifications. So in our experience, at least, they're particularly interested in the informed consent arrangements and the informed consent that you'll take people through. But you know, we've also found the interactions in the studies that we conduct with ethical bodies actually pretty constructive. They're useful. The advice they provide is usually pretty constructive, and that, you know, we think of them really as partners for research. There is some variation, and I'll take you through a case study in the requirements in different countries. You know, local review bodies versus an IRB that may be able to give approval across different countries where additional local requirements aren't in place. So it's really important to understand all that before you make too much progress on your study design, because some of those variations can lead to significant timing delays, for instance, and we've had some real outliers for some countries where, you know, ethical review can take, not necessarily due to shortcomings of the design, but simply the process in those countries can mean it takes a whole lot longer than in other countries. So understanding that is a really important part of your design process. So we carry on then. When to do it then? Certainly getting approval before recruitment begins. And of course, so if you're a vendor, before making any commitments to the sponsor, and not just pre-launch, but actually when the study is ongoing, if there are modifications that are made. And of course, the framework for conducting real-world research means that certainly for longer-term studies, there might be more modifications than perhaps a more traditional clinical trial. So you might need some reapproval if modifications are made, certainly to the protocol or consent materials. But again, think of the ethical review bodies as constructive partners in that situation. And if in doubt, ask for advice. Is a recommendation. So just as one example, really. Study, rare disease study that's been launched globally. It's a community recruited study. So you know, not a traditional site study in most countries, although there are some variations in that. So in some of these countries that you see, an IRB approval was sufficient. So you see the US, UK, Denmark. In other countries, there were local local approval bodies that had to be sought, and in some countries there was even a local principal investigator that was required, and some additional requirements. So really a bit of a patchwork across those different countries. So again, what I said previously about researching this early is a really important piece of advice. Carrying on. So Catherine, back to you for some data capture.
Thank you. So thinking about the actual data that you want to collect during your real world study, and on the next slide, there are examples of some of the common real world data sources that we work with. So as already explained, we work primarily in primary data collection. So our usual sources include things like medical records and clinical data, either alone or in combination with patient and carer reported data. But there are also, of course, a number of large existing data sets out there as well. For the purposes of today's webinar, we're going to focus on those first three. So thinking about medical record and clinical data, and really, again, this is very much a webinar in itself in terms of the length of content here. So what we've tried to do here is to think about some of the key considerations when we are collecting clinical data through sites for a digital real world study. As with any study where you're collecting clinical data, one of the most important things is that engagement and relationship building over time with the clinical sites. Early engagement, making sure that you are speaking to the right people, the people who are actually going to be collecting that data for you, that you're providing appropriate training at the right time, and that you are checking in with that team on a regular agreed basis and really forming a partnership through the collection of that data. One of the things here that's unique, of course, to real-world studies is that the identification and recruitment of patients needs to be done as part of routine clinical practice. So it's really worth involving clinicians early in the design of a study, in particularly thinking about how that recruitment process is going to happen in practical terms, to make sure that you are adhering to the constraints of a real-world study. And thinking about the various methods of recruitment that might happen within a site, whether that's face-to-face appointments, reviewing databases of patients and contacting them by email or telephone. It's worth thinking about what's actually practical from the site's perspective. Now, unique to digital studies, of course, is the usability and the design of an ECRF, an electronic case report form. So not just thinking about what the interface that a patient would see in terms of studies such as this one, but actually thinking about what a site would see. Is it easy for the site staff to be able to interact with your ECRF, to be able to log in, to be able to enter data, to query data, to leave a period of data collection when they're called away to do something else and then to come back to it? All of these things are really important to consider and will maximize the site's engagement and enthusiasm with the study, and ultimately improve the completeness and potentially the quality of your data set. It's also worth thinking early about how you might want to link this electronic clinical data with any patient or carer reported data in your study, if this is applicable to the design. When you're designing a study, it's also really key to think about your data collection time points, particularly over prospective or longitudinal studies, thinking about not just the time points for the patient-reported data collection, which we'll come on to, but are you going to be asking the site to collect data at regular intervals during that follow-up period? And will that involve collecting new data, or will that involve reviewing the data that they inputted at baseline? And again, it's really important to involve sites in that discussion as well, when you're thinking about what's practical in terms of assessment time points, etc., and the time points that fall within regular clinical practice and regular clinic visits for those patients. It's important to think about data quality checks, so particularly around things like monitoring. Are you going to carry out any source data verification? What might that look like? What percentage of the sample, what percentage of the data set might you want to look at? How would you go about that in practical terms for a digital study? All of that, again, is worth discussing with the sites. And then how you're going to handle any missing data. Are you going to be able to query any data? This will, of course, differ for site-reported data versus the patient-reported data. What kind of process are you going to put in place for that? And then finally, a question that we always ask ourselves at the start of any study that involves the collection of clinical and patient-reported data, which is, can or should any of that clinical data set be reported by patients? Do you actually need to go to clinical sites to collect the clinical data? And for us, sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. We've done this both ways. And it largely depends on our assessment of the patient's ability to be able to report the data that we need in terms of their demographics, data around their clinical or treatment history, for example. So there are some of our key considerations when we're designing studies that involve the collection of clinical data. Just moving on. Moving on now to thinking about studies that involve the collection of data from patients or carers. So why do people actually want to do this? So we see a common number of aims. Many people on the webinar today will be familiar with the majority of these, I'm sure. Common aims that we have for collecting this data include demonstrating burden of disease, It's understanding treatment performance in a real world setting from a patient or carer perspective, and then generating very specific data types to input to pharmacoeconomic modelling. So how do we actually do this in terms of a digital study? Well, one of the key things here is thinking about the need to balance the desire to collect everything, particularly when you're designing these large real world studies. You tend to get a lot of people within a sponsor's organisation who want to input into the design and the data set, and that can often end up with a very large potential data set that you would start with. And so it's up to us to really think about balancing that with the participant burden, making it something that the participant is going to want to participate in, making sure it's something that is going to be as easy and straightforward for them as possible, and to encourage them to come back time after time to input that data over a prospective study design. So our general recommendation is that a more focused data set is usually preferable. And then thinking about that patient and carer reported data, how can meaningful evidence be generated? What kind of things are we thinking about when we are designing patient and carer reported studies? And in particular, when we're thinking about how often we might be asking people to enter data onto our data collection platform. It goes without saying really that data analysis needs to be considered from the outset. So both in terms of protocol design, developing statistical analysis plans, working very collaboratively and closely with our analytics team to make sure that any kind of data collection schedule that we're developing meets their needs and ultimately our sponsors' needs in terms of the data that's going to be produced. Typical things that we would think about include things like survey completion frequencies, completion windows, how long are we going to give people in the real world setting to complete their questionnaires, question framing, so recall periods, how often are we asking participants to think back over when they are considering and answering questions, and then the types and formats of response options. So just to bring that to life a little bit more, on the next slide you can see an example of an assessment schedule for a patient-reported study that we conducted. So you can see here the names of the various patient-reported outcome measures, questionnaires. On the left, a brief description of their content, the themes that are covered within them. And then you can see that we've started to think about some of those components that we mentioned. So the number of questions, an estimated completion time in minutes. This is sometimes available within publications, and sometimes you need to have a go at completing it yourself and members of your team completing it. And if you can get access to a group of patients who you are designing a study with, getting them to complete it. And then building up pictures of the various combinations of giving these questionnaires at the same time and thinking about the burden on those participants. Then there's the recall period, and then that ultimately helps us to determine the frequency. So how often we are going to ask people to complete these instruments. And that really does vary from study to study. So moving on now. So within patient-reported and carer-reported studies, what kind of things do we need to think about that are specific to real-world studies? Well, one of them, and anyone on this webinar who is a COA or patient-centered outcomes expert will appreciate the fact that much of the guidance that's available on the selection and implementation of COAs and PROs is largely focused on randomized controlled trials. So for those of us working in the real world and designing real world studies, it can be quite a challenge. We need to work through these guidelines, decide which parts of them are applicable to our particular study, and ultimately be quite creative about our selection process. But we're actually quite excited to see that some recent publications over the last few months have really brought the focus of the selection and use of COAs in real world studies to life. So we're really looking forward to seeing how some of those publications and initiatives progress. And then particular to digital studies. So again, those people who have worked with patient-reported digital studies will understand that one of the first questions that we ask ourselves is whether there are electronic versions of COAs or PRO measures available. If not, how do we go about creating those? So working with instrument developers, license holders, using best practice guidelines to migrate from a paper to an electronic version of an instrument. And then thinking about very specific user groups. Is there anything about your group of patients that means that they need to see something differently on a screen in a different way? It could be eyesight issues, it could be dexterity, for example. And then finally, whether you require any evidence to demonstrate measurement equivalence between the paper and the electronic version, or more recently, the field is going towards thinking about measurement comparability. So what kind of evidence of comparability of paper to electronic scores might you need to produce? So there's some of the things that we are thinking about when we're designing our studies. And just to, again, bring that to life, just on my final couple of slides on this section, examples of eco-immigration that we've undertaken for our project, for 2 of our projects. So you can see here an example of a very straightforward eco-immigration from paper to electronic, the paper version of the item at the top, and then an almost exact replication below. And then you can see on the next screen something which we would call slightly more complicated, where it would fall outside a classic design and where we would have to work with an instrument developer to agree on what this might look like, combining question stems, combining numeric scale, and also combining all of that into something which is going to make it usable and user-friendly for that patient. Thank you. So I'm going to pass back to Mark now to talk about collaborative design.
Thanks, Catherine. So I'm hoping that I'm going to be preaching to the converted about this first slide to a certain extent about the benefits of involving patients in real-world evidence studies and working collaboratively with them. And we've got a range of benefits that we've put on this slide if you want to carry on through those, Anna. Then, you know, in our experience as well, we found these really beneficial. I mean, we're focusing mostly today about the pre-launch design phase, but actually, as we'll talk about more on the subsequent webinar, where we talk more about the implementation phase, it goes right through to implementation, even dissemination of results. So it's really valuable. If you do this right, you know, what we found is, you know, you do better and different research if you engage with patients as early as you can, as frequently really as possible. They're experts by experience, and that's, you know, a really powerful way of thinking about them, particularly maybe for rare diseases where many of us might go into a particular study with less knowledge of that disease than we perhaps more common conditions. So these really valuable patients, experts by experience, should be harnessed, as you'll see, pretty regularly and early. If you go to the next slide, then we've highlighted a few different elements of how we think it's beneficial for engaging with patients collaboratively. So important study design, that can be in the protocol stage. It can be getting input in, as Catherine talked about as well, in the relevance of selection of PRO instruments, for instance. UI UX design, review of any patient-facing materials, usability of the platform. You know, if you're doing it, you know, there's a big risk essentially if you're doing that without getting the input of the end users, if you like. Social media and patient webinars. Well, social media can be a really valuable means of raising awareness of studies, and also a means of providing feedback on certain circumstances of how the studies are going. Patient webinars we've found really valuable. We've had patient advocacy groups who conduct their own webinars for different points in the life cycle of a long-term study. So that could be, for instance, a webinar around the launch period to raise awareness and help with recruitment. And then we've also had patient advocacy groups who run annual webinars to give results feedback about how the study's been going this year, you know, linked to interim analyses that have been carried out. Talked a little bit about review of patient-facing materials, making sure it's easy to understand, to access, recognizing that, of course, there's huge variation in people's expertise and levels of education. And then governance, certainly for long-term studies, we've had huge value in creating scientific advisory boards, which we've made as multi-stakeholder. Now, having patients on those, again, we find really valuable. There's differences of expertise between the experts by experience, the patients, the advocacy groups, and the key opinion leaders. But those different perspectives can be managed, and when they're managed well, that's a really valuable tool that should be started in the pre-launch phase, ideally, to give advice on design, and then carried out through the implementation phase as well. And then finally, publications. We've got many publications where the co-authors are drawn not just from principal investigators, but also advocates, patients as well. Again, it does take some management given different levels of expertise, but it is possible to do. And we have found that those publications are richer for having had that broader engagement with different co-authors. So we go to the next one. I'm going to give a couple of examples actually about a particular part of collaborative design, which is around rewards. Again, for long-term studies particularly, we found rewards absolutely critical to drive, one of the tools to drive engagement and retention in our studies. But we found actually that they're still in discussion with sponsors, not universally used. So I think there's still work to be done in that. And we, if you look up UPATI guidelines about the rewarding of patients for their time, it's absolutely consistent with that type of a framework. So if you carry on to the importance, tailoring is crucial. There's a danger if you don't tailor your reward program that you might have a framework that doesn't really have the salience for the target cohort that you have in your study. So it could be very different from a younger cohort than an older cohort, for instance. So really important to tailor and understand the user experience. And then carrying on, there are different types of reward. It doesn't always have to be money. One of the most easy things that we found in tailoring the rewards programs that we have is that even if you do have some sort of monetary reward, and that, as you can see here, it could be a direct monetary reward to a participant, or it could be a charitable donation. Fair market values apply, so the amounts we're talking about is pretty small. So that's not usually the primary motivation for people to get involved in this type of research. The primary motivation is usually trying to increase, improve understanding of the disease, help address the unmet needs that they will have experienced firsthand. So providing simple feedback that their contribution is valuable and that we are making progress in terms of the study objectives is really, really valuable. And there's different ways of doing that. I talked about webinars from patient advocacy groups, but also we have frameworks for using things like infographics that won't bias people's ongoing responses, but nonetheless give them very nice, simple and easy to understand feedback of how their contribution is helping with the success of the study. So we carry on to the next slide. It's a very simple example. This is a rare disease study where it's a longitudinal study over a number of different countries, multiple PRO instruments, a bit like Catherine showed for a different study. Different age ranges, adults and pediatrics via caregivers. And we had a reward program. And actually, the way the study happened to evolve, we had a cohort who had no rewards, and we had a cohort with rewards. And just very simply in this table, you'll see that without rewards, actually quite a pretty good level of engagement nonetheless of participants completing any survey, 64%, and all surveys, 39%. So there's pretty good engagement already. But if you add in the rewards, 95% of people completing any surveys and all surveys. That's absolutely brilliant level of engagement. And if you think about it from a sponsor perspective, the additional investment of incorporating a reward program into your study is quite small. And I would suggest that the return on investment of that part may be the best investment of the whole study budget. I think there's always a compelling argument to explore the use of rewards in your study. Information governance. So again, this is in some ways a webinar in itself. we didn't want to miss it out though, because it's absolutely critical, and lack of understanding of information governance can lead to significant problems. For the purposes of today's session, really it's just a taster and some pointers for you. So if you go to the first slide, there's a range in doing digital research, there's a range of challenges and variabilities in terms of understanding of users' device. So as we said, you know, the platform we can have participants who could be caregivers, patients, and also clinicians providing data across different range of devices. So it could be a PC, it could be a tablet, it could be a smartphone. There's also different operating systems, there's different resolutions of those devices. And as Catherine's talked about, there's different user types, patients and their proxies, and considerations of accessibility. If you're working with different age groups and with indications where there might be mobility and dexterity problems, those can be challenging in terms of the data entry. And then there's, you know, localization across different languages and countries to make sure that the end participant experience is absolutely appropriate. So here, you know, there's a range of frameworks that I'll just mention on the next slide as well, but EU, now UK GDPR best practices and HIPAA regulations in the US provide frameworks for some of the information governance strategies that you'll need to have implemented. So just some questions really. The framework has to be, the security rigor have to be appropriate and scalable to the number of participants and consistent with the audiences that you'll be using. I've mentioned those frameworks there, a couple of variants of GDPR, HIPAA, and depending on the study cohort, you could have COPPA as well, which is children's in the US. And then if you're working with a vendor, do they have sort of the appropriate levels of experience and certification? So some of the certifications we have around security, the ISOs that you see there, security, quality management, and localization. And then also think about audits. For long-term studies, certainly, if you've got audits included in the statement of work, and is there an audit track record even with the different stakeholders that you're dealing with? I appreciate that's a really, really quick introduction to information security, but yeah, please get in contact if you'd like to talk about it more. I mean, it's really important that you get advice on that. None of these frameworks should be considered as onerous. It's all doable, but yeah, think about it early. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Catherine. So we're at the Q&A part now. So we've had a lot of questions in, and I'm going to choose a couple now to start off with. I think this first one's probably good for Catherine. In this kind of study, real-world study, there is a selection bias as only patients with access to the digital tool could participate. How can we minimize this bias in the study design?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So we have this, I want to say this question, but it's often more of a discussion with a lot of our sponsors up front when we are designing a study. I think the first thing that we do is we challenge them slightly on their assumption around bias. I think if we were asked this question maybe even 5 years ago, it would be a very different picture. But last year, for example, 93% of adults in the UK owned a smartphone. I imagine the trajectory of that trajectory of that data, that would mean that the figure is probably even higher now. And actually in the elderly, so the population over 60, that figure is in the mid 80s. I think it was 83% from the top of my head. So actually more people have access to smartphones than I think we expect. We also have the option within our data collection platform to have a web-based survey as well as an app. So our clients can select between these. So it may be that if somebody doesn't have access to a smartphone or a tablet, for example, they may have access to a desktop. So we can be quite flexible in terms of our design. Then, of course, there is also the option to offer a paper-based alternative. So we do this in very few of our studies. But those where we have worked in a particular population or disease area where it is the majority of the population are very elderly, we have offered a paper-based alternative. And we have had very few people actually take this up. But of course, we then have to talk to our study sponsor about the potential bias in terms of having mixed methods of administration. So how would we deal with the paper versus the electronic data? Would we test for any differences there? So it's certainly something we consider for each study. We appreciate that a small bias still does exist, but we think that that gap is closing.
Fantastic, thanks. Yeah, I know, for example, my 75-year-old mother also has a smartphone, and I think she's actually better at using it than I am at times. So I've got another question here. What type of data can you gather in a rare disease real-world study, and are there any limitations?
Gosh, I think I think the list is absolutely huge. I think really it depends on whether you're looking at clinical data or patient and carer reported data, as we touched on. I think a lot of objectives around clinical data in the real world still tend to focus on real world effectiveness and real world safety. So we often have a lot of discussions around those, but there are other useful pieces of data that you can get from medical records. Treatment pathways is an example. Healthcare resource use is another example that we commonly see. And then in terms of patient reported data, again, there's a wealth of data. We commonly see data around patient reported symptoms, around quality of life, hidden costs. We do a lot of work around the hidden sort of out-of-pocket costs that patients or carers can incur, treatment preference, treatment satisfaction, patient experience. Any more, Mark? The list is huge.
I mean, you're right. And actually, just going through that list, which is already huge, that goes back to what we talked about during the session about the prioritization is important. I mean, as Catherine said earlier, often there's a, when working with sponsor and different functional teams, people have different things they might be interested in. So because the opportunity is so broad, it's very tempting to try and answer lots of questions. But as we said before, you've got to really be focused and not overburden patients. If you do that, you might get nothing if they disengage. I suppose one other thing, it's not really type of data, but one of the considerations we were talking about rare diseases is thinking about really low numbers. I mean, that's one of the things that we have to think about quite a lot. So how do we deal with the fact that actually we've got it's a very rare disease and there's only low numbers? What is the minimum number of participants we will need to achieve this objective? Which is a whole another question, discussion in itself.
Great. Okay, so moving on to another question here. We've got, how do you design a real world study with repeated data collection to ensure participant compliance to answer the question is?
Well,
Mark, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start on that. I mean, obviously, that's a huge driver of the success of that type of study that was mentioned. And we found that one of the key metrics of that, key drivers of that, is having a well-tailored, well-designed reward program. It's not the only thing, but as we said in the body of the webinar, every time we use one, it's well-tailored, you get good results. Now, additionally, all of the other sort of soft things that we've talked about, making sure that the participant experience, the motivation of the participant is good, that they will have in participating in this study, hopefully quite an engaging experience. That goes back to designing the right study for the right participants. And how do you do that? Well, you talk to them. You talk to the patient advocacy groups. You share your design with them right from the start. So there's not one sort of single magic wand to wave, but there's a few different things that give you the best chance of having that engagement over time. But you can't guarantee it, of course. And I think what we're always trying to do is, instead of having a steep fall off of engagement and retention, that it's as shallow as we can make it.
Okay, thank you. So we're almost at time, so I'm going to squeeze in one last question. So we have quite a lot, and we're going to get back to everyone individually for your questions today. So we've got, I'll just do this last one. How is your experience with social media recruitment? Do these patients visit the clinic at some time point, or can have a remote diagnosis?
Yeah, I can probably answer this one. I can go quite quickly on this one. We have another webinar which you can access through our website, which is all about validation of diagnoses when you're not recruiting through clinical site settings. So that should give you a lot more in-depth information. But there are ways of validating patients' diagnoses, either using the data collection platform or through other methods when you're not recruiting through sites. So yes, it can be done without patient visits to the clinic. And again, it's all about that collaborative design process. In terms of experience with social media recruitment, we have a variety of experience. It's been very successful. Obviously, people get quite nervous when we suggest this, but there are ways of doing it that can be more controlled and can often make our clients feel a bit more comfortable. So yeah, we're very happy to discuss those further.
Amazing. And I'm gonna wrap it up now, but I did have a last question about could we talk a bit more about minimum number of patients needed? We will be talking about this a bit more in the second part of this webinar, which will be next month, where we talk about implementation of real world studies, and we can cover those topics next month. So I'd just like to finish up now saying thank you so much, Mark and Catherine, for your expertise here, and we look forward to seeing you all next month for how to successfully implement a real world study, and we'll talk about the next part of the strategy next month. So hope to see you all there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.